Welcome. Good morning. Hi, I'm Brad Green. I'm with the Angular team from Google. We have some other team members here in the front. They'll be presenting as well. There's Mishko, Brian, and Igor. I'm the manager. I actually don't know too much, but bear with me. I know it's a long day. Did anyone tell you it's 3 hours in this room? Good comfy seats, I hope. Don't fall asleep. Okay, so how many folks are actually familiar with Angular, have written some Angular code? Oh, good, about half. And so maybe some of you know we have just completed our 1.2 release, and we're very excited about what we've done. It took a long time. Our 1.0 release was over 1.5 years ago, and here we are back at DevVox a year later with a new release. We're going to be talking about some of the features today at the end, but we've divided it into 3 sections so we can make it digestible. We'll take a little break between each of the sections. Here in the first part, I will kind of walk us through the basics of building an Angular application. All of the kind of nitty-gritty stuff you need to pull together a simple app. I'll work on some concepts, and at the end, we'll show an end-to-end running application that's pretty representative of things you might build. Mishka will come up next, and he's going to talk to us about how Angular works, about how it's all put together and how we've implemented it so you can really understand what we've done. And then at the end, Brian and Igor will come up and talk about some of the new features we've just released in Angular 1.2. So to get started, I'll just jump right into the code. If you're getting going for the first time, something like this is what you want to do for the HTML template that you'll load. In a file like index.html for your app, you'll write a couple script tags. We'll focus on those first. Down at the bottom, we'll include the Angular source. You can get angular.js from our website. You go to angularjs.org, or you can link to it from our CDN at Google. And then you'll have some script for your own application, maybe a couple files, but we'll just include our cool app.js so we can get going. At the top, there's this funny thing that's an attribute that you haven't seen before, maybe, called ngapp. And ngapp tells Angular which part of the page should it process. In Angular, we build our templates in HTML, and Angular can either manage the entire page, which is what we're saying here by putting ngapp on the HTML tag, or we can just manage a portion of it. I'm also specifying as part of ngapp a name. And we'll talk about this a lot, but this is the name that I use to kind of pull my app together. It's how I manage the dependencies from my application. Then in the code, again, this is just kind of boilerplate startup. I will also specify that name, cool app. I can name it anything I want. It's not too important. But I'll create this myapp variable that points to something called an Angular module, where I pass in cool app, and I also pass it an array of other dependencies. We'll talk more about what that means. Mishka will go into some depth on it later. So that's what I'll do. You can just kind of keep this in mind. All of the other examples that I have are subsections, like little pieces that build on this. Just kind of imagine that this is part of the template you've already built. I want to start with some of the principles that we use to build Angular, some things that are always going to be true about what we build in AngularJS. So first, we care deeply that we're removing barriers to building applications by reducing the amount of boilerplate that you have to build. The amount of code that you have to write to just satisfy a browser, we would like to be much less. And this is kind of, Mishko tells this story a lot, but Angular came out of frustration with existing tools. And one of the things that we wanted to do is be able to express our applications in far less code. Secondly is whenever I come to write a new application, I often have to kind of invent the structure every time. And we wanted to have kind of some default structure that allowed me to start from a level up, but also to let other developers, when they come to my application, know what to expect. And then last, we wanted to make sure that not only was the framework itself well tested, but that the easiest thing to do was to write code that itself is easy to test, fast to write, and maybe even fun to do. So to begin with, talking a little bit about the structure, I think one of the things that we're known for in Angular is the structure called model view controller. It's a way to organize code to break down the responsibilities of my application. where we represent the view of my application, what the user sees, in the DOM. That's no surprise. These are web apps. But the way it's set up is that everything in an Angular app is driven from the DOM. In the DOM, we'll set it up, we'll see that we set it up to observe data in my application that we'll call the model. This is just a portion of some of the data that's probably in a database. I pull it off the server, I pull it into some JavaScript objects in memory. And then we will set up the view, the DOM, to observe it. And then anytime that data changes, we want that view to update. And for the most part, this can happen automatically in Angular if we set it up the right way. I also need a place where I can put logic, things that modify the behavior of my application, rather than just updating based on data that comes back from the server. If I want to put some of this control in it, I put it in these JavaScript classes that we annotate. We call them controllers. So the flow of the application is that I load the page up, my view renders, it pulls in data from the model. If a user interacts with my page, it notifies the controller that something happened. And then this is where it gets a little different. If I've built applications in jQuery or some other languages, some other libraries, the temptation is to, in my controller, to go then, oh, I need to go register some callbacks with the DOM and do some work there. Instead, the thing you need to think about is, in the controller, when I get notified the user has done something, I should just go update the model, update some JavaScript objects, and then the view will update by itself to show off that reflection. So how do we do this? So in code, the model, I kind of mentioned it, but it's just some JavaScript object, which might be represented by some JSON that comes back from the server. The view is HTML, but with some additional things in it. And we'll talk a lot about what these things are, where I can insert the pieces of the model into the UI so that it gets reflected when they change. And then last, some kind of JavaScript controllers where I can expose the parts of the model that I want into the UI and add business logic. Now, in a real app, sorry, if I back up, you notice here I'm setting my model equal to a JavaScript object. Normally, I wouldn't do that. Normally, I would retrieve it from a server. We would do something like ask some service to retrieve that for us, and we'll talk about how that might work later. So to talk about how we get this model view controller paradigm to work in Angular, I'm going to talk about three of the main features that we have. I call them the 3 Ds: data binding, dependency injection, and directives. And we'll start here with data binding. So what I want to do is I want to take some simple JavaScript object, or maybe just a property here, and reflect it into the UI. So if in hello.js I say, hey, my object.greeting equals hola. To be able to reflect that into a template in my hello.html, we have these kind of special ways to make this happen. The first way, which we could call one-way data binding, meaning there's no sort of update back to the model, we use these double curlies. You probably have seen this in other templating languages, where between the double curlies, I can just refer to some expression, and that will be rendered into the DOM for me. The sort of two-way data binding, we use an attribute called ng-model, where I can set it equal to, again, some expression, and I can have it update that model. So if this is on an input tag, it will immediately set the input's value to whatever is in greeter.greeting. But if the user starts typing, the model gets updated as well. Let's take a look at that. Model gets updated as well. Let's take a look at that. So here we have that code. But just to show the rest of it, to set up that I want to be able to pull data from something called a greeter, I'll tell it the name of the class that I want to pull this from. So I'll say ngController equals greetController as greeter. Now, for folks who have been doing Angular for a while, this is new. This is a change for 1.2. It's a new syntax but we think it's a lot simpler and gets you into less trouble. Igor and Brian will talk a bit about that. But then I can just use it in my double curlies and in my input. Let's go see how that works. All right, so what I saw in the double curlies gets rendered here. And if I type, I notice that it updates automatically. And it gets re-rendered anywhere that I use it in my view. So that's kind of fun. Now the other bit, the controller itself. So here's some special syntax. Remember at the top for my boilerplate, I'm going to set up a variable called myapp. And Angular has a function called module, where again, I'm going to pass it just this name coolapp that I set up in the template. And then I'll ask myapp to add a controller that we can refer to later. We'll call it the greet controller. And that just defines a function where I'm setting a member to greeting. Okay. So basic templates, very little code. I can wire up my model to my UI, and I can expose the pieces that I want to see in there. One little bit to note, that UI that I had for having the double curlies, that works fine in every case except for the first page load, meaning sort of the index.html. And we'll talk later about how we segment the different partial views of our application. But what I want to do for the first view is something like this. Let me talk about why this is a problem. So back in my application, my hello.html, you notice that this template comes before my script tag. So what this means is this double curlies little bit here, this can actually get rendered to the user before Angular gets a chance to come in and replace it with what I actually want to see. And so to prevent that, what we can do is we can put a special attribute called ngCloak on any element where I'm using these double curlies. And it will hide that. And there's just a selector that sets display to none, and then when Angular kicks in, we remove that so that it displays. There's an alternate syntax where I can do it through an attribute called ngBind, where I can say ngBind equals some object.something. And this is equivalent to exactly what's above it. Just different ways to do the same thing. So I've been kind of blasely, if that's a word, using these things, these extra attributes in HTML. These are what we call directives, one of the other of the 3 Ds, that allow us to extend HTML syntax to do new things. And the way I like to think about it is this is a way that we can declaratively, without any code, hook up our logic and extend the structure and behavior of the template in a way that's very easy to read. And what this says right here, these are a couple different directives, ngRepeat, ngBind, ngClick. So ngRepeat says, hey, take a controller called cart, get its items, and repeat through it, meaning stamp out the span and the button for every time there's an item in items. Let's take a look at how this runs. So in our cart here, we have exactly the same code where we say we're going to go through the items and items. For each one, we're going to display the item name using ngBind. And we're going to create a button that allows me to delete them. So let's take a look at this working. So here's my shopping cart. Chocolate, bread, and coffee, most important things. I hope we had some this morning. If I click delete, they go away. If I reload, they come back because they're just there in my controller. All right, so for the controller itself, again, we're going to create a controller. We'll call it cart controller. we'll set up a list of items. Normally, this would come off a server in some sort of data feed in JSON or whatnot. And I will also, on the controller, I'm going to add a delete function. And the function just simply takes that array and is going to remove whatever's at the index. Now, the way we pass it, that information, is right here on this ng-click line, where I set up this click listener that says, if somebody clicks on it, and this is different than a regular click listener, in that I will call the cart.delete with this variable $index. $index is special inside ng-repeat, and it's just set to the current iteration number. So that in cart.js, when I get called, I get passed an index, and I can delete the right item from my array. All right. Now, if you're doing HTML data validation, there is an alternate syntax for the directives that are used as attributes, where you can prefix them with data dash. So if you're doing validation, data dash, not doing validation, you don't have to have it. It's easier to type. There you go. Okay. Last of the 3Ds, dependency injection. So we've looked at directives, how we create new widgets in our application, how we extend the syntax. But for talking about how do we wire our applications together, we have a feature where if I want to represent something in my application that other parts of my application rely on, I can easily define it by, if there's a class called myFoo that's implemented with what I need to do, I can expose it to the rest of my application through something like this. On every module, there's a function called service, where I can expose this service under the name foo and then use it by simply asking for it. So notice this function, myBar, if it needs to use a foo, we have this special syntax in Angular where just by putting it in your method signature, it automatically gets passed to you and you can use it. Now, in here, if we ask, is foo an instance of myFoo, this comes back as true. I set this up just so that we could see how it works, that these things get instantiated. Now, the preferred syntax for this, though, is not to create my services on the global namespace, but instead do them as inline functions where, as we did with the controllers, we just give them a name as part of the module definition. All right, so we've seen structure. I'll talk a little bit about how we eliminate boilerplate. I think we've seen a lot of the ways we do it. So dependency injection helps me wire up my application. It removes a lot of the code that we normally have to write. And although there isn't really a main function, if you're used to C or Java, in web applications, there is usually this sort of config part of my application where I kind of wire up what talks to what and satisfy dependencies. The dependency injection we have in Angular gets rid of that. When we do data binding, you notice there's no special code to write. We can use just plain old JavaScript objects, or POJOs. This is important for readability, testability, able to extend my application, but it's also really important if I want to use other libraries that work on my model objects. If I wanted to use underscore or Lodash, or other database libraries that work on them, it's very easy because they are just regular JavaScript objects. And if you noticed, most of the time we were touching the DOM, we didn't write any specific code that touched them. We went through directives. And this is another key takeaway. Like I was talking earlier about how to think about the structure of my app, that controllers should, instead of manipulating the DOM, they actually just manipulate the model and let the UI update automatically. Same is true here. Like I don't put DOM manipulation code in my controllers either. That is the realm of directives. You can write your own directives. We won't go into that too much in today's talk, but there is, and we'll give you a list of the other places that we're going to appear here at Devoxx. There's another session this afternoon where you can spend 3 hours with us learning about how we do directives. All right. So finally, to wrap a little bit more on the templates. So we've seen how we use directives and data binding to put these templates together. So directives, we've seen using the markup. There's a couple other components that we provide. One is form validation. I won't go too much into that today, but Angular has a pretty rich environment for saying what is a valid, what's a dirty state on a form, what are error states, and highlighting to users things that they need to fill in. We also have this clever little thing called filters, where a lot of times when I get data back from the server, it's in a server-friendly format, but I may want to transform it into something that's more friendly for users. So for example, if I have a place in my UI where I'm displaying the invoice total, like that may be a number, but what I want is a nicely formatted version of this that maybe is localized with the right symbol and the right notation for where the decimal point goes. And so the syntax for doing this thing called a filter is just like in Unix, where I can pipe something, but I take some expression that I want to modify, and I can pipe it through one of these filters. Filters, there's a bunch of them that actually come with Angular. There's currency, there's things like date, uppercase, lowercase. But these are really just there kind of as examples of things that you might want to write. And it's actually very easy. So if I want to write my own filter, just like we have registered other things on the application module MyApp, we can just register a filter, which is just a function that gets the input of whatever the expression evaluated to. And then I can do what I want with it, and I return the output. So here's an example of reverse. That will reverse the string. Nothing complex about the code. Okay, a couple more things on controllers. So far we've seen that this is the place that I will expose the model, the portion of the model that I want to my view by setting it onto this variable. It's also where I can put functions that I want to be able to call so that when users interact with it, I can handle that in my code. And it's also the place that I update the model to change the view. A couple other things. This is also one thing to know is that these controllers are created once per use in your template. So let's take a look. If I've got a controller, the greet controller, and we've seen this before, greet controller just sets up a greeting. That's not a greeting. And we can use it. If I have two controllers that are specified the same, but just in two different places, I actually get two different copies of it. It's instantiated once per use. So if we use it here, notice at the beginning, they both say hi there because they both have the same initial state that was set up here. But if I modify this one, it doesn't update the other one. They're separate copies. Okay. And then, but also, you can request something called a scope. Now, if you have been doing Angular for a while, you're very familiar with scope. This was previously the recommended way to get at or to expose things to your DOM. And the way you would get one is just like any other dependency that we want to get at in an application, where I can just say, hey, my greet controller is a function that takes a $ scope. It will automatically get passed in. There's a number of services that Angular provides. The ones that Angular provides are prefixed with this $. So if you see something with the $ in front of it in an example, you know that's actually something that the Angular framework itself gives you. We recommend that you actually don't put $ in front of your own code so that you can keep them separate in your mind. And then to use it in the template, instead of saying greet controller as something else, you just say greet controller. Okay, a couple things about scope. So why would I use this? So this is actually, if I'm using the controller and syntax, this is exactly the same thing that's going on. So if you're using controller as, we just automatically set it to, we actually just put the this variable on it automatically for you. But this is the context for evaluating the expressions. This is the set of variables, the set of the model that I can use when I try to expose things in the UI. the scopes are actually nested. If I have divs nested within divs, each of the divs can have a controller and therefore have a scope, and they nest one after another. And so scopes can have parent scopes that you can communicate with, so you can pass data back and forth up and down the DOM tree. One thing to know about this inheritance, though, we're using the prototypical inheritance model of JavaScript. So this means the reads are global. You read what's from your parent, but if you write to it, if you change it, it's only going to be for you. And let's just see that example. Let's just see that example, an example of that. Oh, sorry, I missed doing the example of scope, but we've kind of seen this. Where I can say Greek controller. But here on checking out the scope inheritance, let's say if I've got an index.html that looks like this, where I'll set ngModel up to display a message. I'll have one controller here that uses the same message and a second controller here that uses the message again. So the reason we have this controller as syntax is because it kind of avoids a problem that we're going to see here in a second. So if I go to show it off, where I've got my 3 text fields here. So here's the root one. If I start editing it, I notice they all edit together. Now, if I change one of the children, though, I notice that one doesn't update. Now, this one is now updating the first and the third. And now if I modify the second one, it also becomes disconnected, and now none of them update each other. So this is kind of unexpected behavior. The way you would avoid this in using scope is if instead of actually modifying a property directly, you actually want to bind instead to a property of an object. So you would say something like text.message instead of message itself. And this would fix the problem. You'd have to go update it in your controller as well. So something like this. So when we're using controller as, it automatically fixes that for us. It also provides a couple of different APIs that are going to be important in building real apps. So this data binding that we do, where the UI automatically updates whenever the model changes, you can actually use yourself. So if you actually need to do some work, like you want a function to be called when some part of the model changes, you can set it up yourself by calling the scopes watch function. So watch takes an expression, meaning some set of properties that I want to watch, could be functions as well, and then a callback, the thing that you want to get called. The thing to realize about this is that watch is going to evaluate in the context of the scope that you've called it on. So it's only going to have access to the properties that are part of that scope. This is a good way to separate the concerns of your application. It also has a method that we won't talk too much about today, but it's called $apply. All of this data binding that happens inside Angular happens because the Angular has a cohesive system where we monitor all of the events, and we know when changes could have occurred to the model, like when a timeout happens, or an XHR comes back, or the event loop comes around. If something happens outside of the Angular framework, we use $apply to tell Angular, hey, it's time to go check, did the model get updated outside of Angular's loop of control? So we've been talking about these things, expressions. I've been saying it a couple times. We see them inside our markup, inside the curly braces. We also see it inside some directives. It looks like JavaScript, but it actually isn't. This is actually our own expression language. We've built a parser and an executor for it. You can't do things like complex logic. So you may have looked at these expressions and said, well, I don't know if I really want to put my logic in the template. We actually don't think that's a good idea either. So you can't actually do things like loops and throws. Like you can't do too much branching either, but we have recently in 1.2 added the ternary operator. A lot of folks beat us up on this for a while, and we realized that this is actually a good thing in templates. Some examples of expressions that we've seen, like person.name, I can call functions. If I have a shopping cart, I can call the total and put that in my UI. And we can even do things like math. You can do cart.total minus user.discount rate and have that in a UI somewhere. All right, another piece of the puzzle in building applications is how do we talk to servers? I think the jQuery library did a really nice thing by wrapping the XHR. We've taken our own take on this that will automatically update any dependencies on the information that comes back from the server in a service called $HTTP. And this being a service is something that I can request and just use in my application anywhere that I need to. We'll see an example of using this later. If you want a little bit of a higher level interaction model, if you've got a RESTful resource on your server, we've got this thing called $resource. And it allows me to communicate with RESTful data resources. There's a bunch of other options. So outside of what Angular provides, there's a competitor, and maybe people would argue an upgrade from $resource called RESTangular. You want to check this out. There are cool things like AngularFire, which binds to this real-time database in the cloud. And if you're interacting with SQL data sources in the back end, there's another library called Breeze.js, and there's a lot of great Angular examples out there for that. So a little bit on $HTTP. To use it, it's pretty simple. I can just call it by saying $HTTP, like get, post, any of the other methods that way, and assign it to a variable. Has anyone noticed something strange about this line of code? It looks like it's synchronous, right? And of course it can't be, but it's actually not. You can use your code like this. I can then data bind to some data in the UI, and the way this works is when the data finally comes back from the server, Angular notices, and we will update the UI and put it in. So you can go ahead and bind to things that don't exist yet, and when they come back from the server, we just populate the UI. Now, you would probably want to have to do what I'll call a more full form of get, where you specify what to do on success and what to do on error. But still, you notice like this also looks kind of synchronous in that I can call success and error immediately on it. But what these do is they just set up a state machine that gets executed later. And they can do it because HTTP returns what's called a promise. And promises look like synchronous code. It's just a better way to organize callbacks. If you're familiar with promises, we have recently in the 1.2, we've upgraded them so they're compliant with what's called the A+ promise suite. And I think Igor might talk about that a little bit later. All right, last piece of the puzzle for building real apps, and then we'll take a look at that app that I was suggesting we would take a look at. When I build a real app, usually it's structured something like this. I'll have some kind of static header. There might be some links in it, but that doesn't move in my application. It doesn't change. And then I've got maybe some left nav. There could be some expanding or collapsing things over there. But then in the center of my application, I've got some kind of content view that will update depending on what I click in the header or where I click in the left nav. If I'm building a mobile application, it's a little bit different. Well, I'll probably just show the nav and I'll slide back and forth to the content view. But the concepts are the same. And in Angular, we put these together with something called routes. And when I'm building a route, in the template itself, the place that I want to have that content view, there's a special directive called ngView. And then I use something called a route provider to configure a couple different pieces of the route. One, I'll set up a controller that gets created for me whenever this route gets activated. I'll set up a template. This is the piece of HTML that gets loaded for me. And then the URL, meaning if somebody enters a certain URL on my app, if Angular sees this, we should automatically switch to this route, create the controller, and load the template for you. So to put this into sort of real app terms, we're going to go see an application that's kind of my plan for retirement, how I'm going to take over the world with my mail app, because Gmail is getting kind of old now. So if we wanted to say that when in the URL path we see /inbox, we want to load a template called inbox.html. We want to create a controller called inbox controller, and we want to expose it as inbox. So let's take a look at the app altogether. All right, so the app itself is very impressive. UX gods beware. All right, so I've got a list of my email messages, and if I click on them, I get through and I can see data there. But notice, I don't know if you can see it, but as I'm clicking, you notice that the URL is updating. If I update the URL myself, if I type here inbox, it automatically updates the content. I also have a bunch of different menu items here. I haven't implemented them yet, I'll be honest. There's a lot of work to do. But also notice that updates the URL, and that if I change the URL manually, like to compose, it automatically highlights the right thing and switches the view back for me. Let's take a look at how all this works. All right, so the first thing that happens is we load this index.html. And we've done, I added Bootstrap to it so it could look okay. That's the first couple lines here in the head. So the part that is my header here, it's just an H1. The part that is my left nav, we'll take a look at that in a moment. That's the set of divs here. And then the thing that switches is this ng view. All right, so we'll take a look at how that nav works in a little bit, but let's switch to my inbox view. So here's the piece of code that gets loaded when we want to see the inbox. And this is not surprising, where I've got an ng repeat. I want to see the message for every message in inbox. And I'll pull out the message's sender, the date. But notice here, the date, we'll take a look at how the date is formatted. But the date is just an epoch. I'll pipe it through the date filter so it shows up nicely. And I get this nice formatted November 10th. The data actually, in this case, and if you notice, all my other examples I've been serving just out of file colon. There's no server involved. Because I'm requesting templates and JSON data off the server, I actually need a web server so the browser doesn't complain about security to me. And then notice here the last thing, the list of subjects is a link, so that when I click on one, it takes me through to the actual email itself. The way we've set this up is the link itself has a data binding in it where I say I want to link to message / and then some index. Now to see how this works, we should go take a look at the route that we've set up in mailapp.js. All right, so we were just taking a look at this previously. We've set it up so that if I see / in the URL, meaning if the user types nothing after this, we should go to load a template called inbox.html. We'll instantiate the inbox controller. We'll make it available under inbox. And I'm adding this extra property called name. We'll take a look at why I'm doing that later. But you can add any properties that you want to be available when the path changes. One thing about the template URL, Angular will automatically, by default, it will load this over the web for you whenever somebody invokes a route. You're actually in control of this. There's something called the template cache. So if you want to preload some of these things, you can actually inline them in your first template download so they're just available for the user. And you can just fetch them over HTTP. So if the user loads the first page without the templates, you can start downloading them so that they're available when the user clicks on it. But by default, it loads on demand. So then we have a couple other routes. So there's one for the message that we formatted to say, if I see /message/ and if there's something that's going to be replaced by some kind of data, we put a colon in front of it. We say, hey, we want to refer to this as ID. And we set up the same thing for the message controller and the message itself. And then we have all of our things that just resolve to to-do. There's one little thing at the bottom here that's otherwise, where if none of these things matched, where should we go? And we just say redirect to /, which will put you back in the inbox. All right, so how do we set this up? The inbox controller itself, here's how we implemented it. We said that we'll fetch messages, and messages is a dependency that we said we want to use in our inbox controller. And we'll set it up so that the messages is just set on our self variable so that we can refer to it later. The messages itself, we've defined up here that it will use HTTP, and we'll just tell it to get this messages.json file. You can see that here. There's just JSON that has all of the message stuff. And again, the dates are formatted in epoch, and we use the date filter to make them look nice. And we return the response data from that. And then we can use it in our controller. Similarly, in the message controller, we'll want to just pick out a particular message. So we get to ask for this thing called, in addition to the message, we also ask for this thing called route params. Route params will contain everything about the route, including, for example, the part of the route that appears at the end that contains the ID for my message. So we set up these URLs. You probably can't see at the bottom, but the first one says messages/0. This is messages/1/2. When I click on it, the URL updates to message/2. That ID, number 2, gets passed via the route params, and I can pull out from the messages array the exact one that I want to display. So that then in the message detail partial, we can display that data. Here's the subject, sender, date, and the message body. All right, just one other, and then we have all these to-do bits we haven't implemented yet. They just load a template. There's no functionality there. The one other little bit that's kind of cool is this nav controller. Let's take a look at the template, and we'll come back to this. So in the index, this is just it's a list where, in order to make these things look active, I have to set an active class on them. But I can use Angular to do that for me, where I say ng class equals, and the syntax for this can take a map, and it'll set active if this thing returns true. So I created a function on, here at my controller, I said nav controller as nav, and I can call nav.is to say, like, am I in the inbox, am I in compose? And the way I implemented that is I just, as part of nav controller, I ask for $route, and I say I want to return route.current.name is equal to title. So the title is what I pass in, from the template, and I'll compare it to the name. And if you remember back in the config function for route provider, I just set the name equal to whatever. So this is some arbitrary piece on the map that I put in, gets passed to me, I can use it to tell that in inbox that I should set active or not. Okay? So a couple other things. If you're new to Angular, it's a pretty big world. There's a lot of things outside of what we on the Angular team provide. By the way, Angular is built not just by folks at Google, but by hundreds of folks all around the world. This last release, there were over 200 folks who've submitted pull requests that are part of the release. Some things to get started. If in the world of tools, we built this application called Battering. It's a Chrome Developer Tools plugin that allows you to inspect the running state of an Angular app and debug it and find out its performance characteristics. If you're looking for an editor, almost every editor has some sort of Angular template support. I think WebStorm maybe has some of the best. Things like Sublime have some very good support too, but most of the folks on the team do use WebStorm. For testing, not only did we want the framework to be testable, we built some infrastructure called Karma, which we think is the fastest, maybe easiest to use test runner. Brian is going to have a session tomorrow, so if you want to learn about using Karma to test JavaScript, and by the way, Karma is not just for Angular. Karma works for any JavaScript you want to test. You can find out about it there. Karma's for unit tests. For doing end-to-end tests, where I'm testing the entire application itself, there's a woman named Julie Ralph up in Kirkland, who in the US, who built this application called Protractor. It's built on top of WebDriver, and it allows you to build these end-to-end tests for Angular. Unlike WebDriver, Protractor actually knows about the Angular framework and helps you write these tests by knowing about this Angular sort of event structure. So in WebDriver, when I'm writing a test, usually the format is something like, I say, well, load the app, and then do something, and then I wait or I poll to see, am I okay to continue? In Protractor, we automatically know when all of the XHRs have come back, when timeouts have occurred, and the app can just continue. Makes my code a lot easier to read. In terms of UI components, I can write my own directives, but a lot of times I don't want to, and there are a number of libraries out there. One of the biggest open source ones is built on the Twitter Bootstrap components. It's called UI Bootstrap. But there's also commercially available libraries like Kendo UI and Wijmo. In terms of libraries, there's hundreds of libraries. I mentioned a couple of these already. I already talked about Breeze.js. There's some good videos on using it with Angular. Same for Firebase. Firebase actually has an API called AngularFire that you can use to talk to its database. And companies like Salesforce.com have built, I think Salesforce built a pretty cool mobile suite for building Angular apps against their backend. Now for learning Angular, there are a ton of books. I actually wrote the one with a fish on it, which is probably its best-selling feature. But there's some other good ones. The one right below it I think is also very good, also written by a core contributor. You probably can't read it, but it's called Mastering Web Application Development with AngularJS. If you buy my book with a fish, you can also feel good about it. All of my proceeds go to the Anita Borg Foundation to support women in technology. For learning Angular online, there's a couple of things I should point you to. First, you should definitely go through the tutorial that we created. It's not maybe the sassiest looking application, but it's very complete. It takes you through all of the pieces that I just went over today, plus animations, plus testing, both unit and end-to-end testing. It's very good. There's a set of over 50 sort of bite-sized 3 to 5 minute videos that describe all of these features in Angular at a site called egghead.io. If you pay a lot of money, you can actually download them and take them with you. It's very good. There's a relatively new site called thinkster.io. And Thinkster, they have two things. One is a sort of prescribed learning path through all things that are Angular, not just the Angular docs, but blog posts and sort of important readings all over the place. They also have a ridiculously detailed tutorial on building a kind of a real-ish application. One of them uses MongoDB as the backend. Another one, they have the same application written with Firebase on the backend. And if you're looking for a very in-depth online course, the only one on here that costs money, there's a site called Pluralsight, and I think they have 4 or 5 different Angular courses that you can take online. Okay. I will take questions, and then we'll take a little break before we get to Mishko's presentation. Time for a couple questions. Sorry, I can't see back there. Yes? Oh, okay, great, yes. What are the new features in 1.2? We are going to cover that in the third part of the presentation today. Great question. I'm glad you asked. Right over here. So the question was, I referred to an ID in the route. In the case here, the ID, now normally in a regular application, the ID would come from the database probably, is the thing that I refer to. In my code, I'm just referring to the ID of the order of the piece of JSON that comes back. So this is the first one, sorry, this is the 0th one, the first one, the second one. And the way I refer to it in my template is I use that $index to say that, hey, here's the ID in the array because this is the number of the iteration through message in inbox.messages. Does that make sense? Oh, yes. I refer to the ID variable. So here in my route provider setup, I said that, hey, if you see /message, also expect something to be after that message. And this is where I named it. This is the only part where it actually becomes a part of my app. And it says make whatever's after the colon, and there actually is no colon, it just says, hey, this is a variable. Make it available to my message controller through the route params, where I can say route params.id. That's how that's connected. Yeah, good question. Other questions? Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and Mishka will come back to explain how all of this stuff works under the covers. Thanks, guys.